Good morning and welcome to Phos for Us, Managing Phosphorus on Organic Farms webinar. We'd like to thank you for joining us this morning, and I'm speaking to you today from Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada, situated on Treaty 4 lands with a presence in Treaty 6. These are the territories of the Nahawak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis and Michif nations. I'd like to welcome just to go through a few housekeeping rules for those of you who are new to our webinar and the GoToMeeting format. So just to help you a lot with your quality, both the video and audio, if you can shut down any programs that are running in the background. That would help you out a bit. All of our listeners are in listen-only mode. Only moderators and panelists can speak. However, you can ask questions by using the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen there, and you will see the red arrow pointing to the questions box, so you can enter your questions there. If you are phoning in using your phone, please enter the audio PIN when you joined the webinar, or you would have done that. And if you didn't enter a PIN, please ensure that your phone is muted at all times so we can reduce background noise. There will be time at the end of today's presentation to answer your questions. So we will be monitoring that questions box, and we will ask Joanne to answer those for us at the end. Just to remind you, the webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will receive an email link for the recording the day after the webinar. And please finally bear with us if we sometimes have a few technical glitches as we move along. We're trying to do our best to make them run as smoothly as possible. Joanne Thiessen Martens has provided two handouts that are some supplementary materials for her presentation, and you can download those just by clicking on them. And also, one of our gold sponsors, Altec, has provided a handout with some details about their products, so you can download all of those, all of that information. Starting out by thanking our gold sponsors, grain millers. We can't do our webinars without our sponsors and our attendees and our speakers. So it's a combination of all of you that make this possible. Our second gold sponsor for this webinar is Alltech Crop Science. And our bronze sponsors, Sunripe Foods International, ProCert Organics, and BioFert. And we have one supporter sponsor this time, OCIA International Canada. So thank you to all of our sponsors. For those of you who aren't familiar with Sask Organics, we're the industry association for certified organic farmers and processors in the province. We're a farmer-led nonprofit representing 964 organic crop producers and 150 certified organic entities in the province. And we have just over 1 million acres under organic management in the province. So now, while you're all here to hear our presentation today from Joanne Thiessen Martens. Joanne is a Ph.D. student in the Department of Soil Science at the University of Manitoba. Joanne has worked in organic farming research and extension for many years at the U of M and elsewhere, drawing together research results and on-farm experience to develop guidelines for organic farmers. She is currently pursuing a Ph.D. in the Department of Soil Science at the University of Manitoba, looking at phosphorus dynamics and the potential for struvite as a fertilizer in organic systems. So without further ado, over to Joanne. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marla. Thank you to everyone today for joining us to talk about this super important topic. I'm going to share my screen with you. So if someone can let me know if you're able to see that, that would be great.
We can see it, yes.
Okay, perfect. I just have to rearrange some windows here. Okay, so I was invited to talk to you today about phosphorus on organic farms. And this is something that has been on my mind for years, really, actually decades at this point. as I started working with organic producers in extension and research quite a long time ago, I guess in the early 2000s or so. And so it's been a topic that I've thought about a lot, and I'm now devoting my Ph.D. research to phosphorus dynamics in organic systems and looking particularly at struvite as a potential phosphorus source. So I'm not going to focus on the struvite aspect today, but it'll come up a little bit, but just in general about phosphorus management for organic farmers, which is so challenging for so many reasons. Let's see, my slide doesn't want to go. That's weird. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we're going to go through a few different aspects about phosphorus management. First, in general, like why this is important, what makes it hard, and in general, but also in particular for organic farmers, and then talk a little bit later about how we can actually manage phosphorus on organic farms, how we know that we might have a phosphorus deficiency, and then what we can do about it once we know that. So why do we need to worry about phosphorus for crops in the first place? It is considered one of the major nutrients, macronutrients for crops, even though they only take up, a few pounds per acre, let's say, in a year. So it's less than nitrogen, but it's incredibly essential for plant function and growth. So it's used for cell division because phosphorus makes up an essential part of DNA and RNA, all those molecular components, as well as cell membranes, and it's also essential in energy storage and transport. If you think back to high school biology, maybe you learned about things like ATP, the ATP cycle. The P in ATP stands for phosphorus. It's so when plants are low in phosphorus, all of those growth and energy management processes can be impaired, and so then you get symptoms like just generally poor growth, delayed development, especially flowering can be delayed, reduced flowering in general, not just delayed, reduced root growth. And in particular, you can get poor nodulation and nitrogen fixation in legumes, which is, of course, a really important part of organic systems where we're relying on green manures for our nitrogen supply. So you might see, like the photo here on the bottom, these plants that have sort of a purplish tinge to them. This is fall rye that was planted in the spring as a cover crop this year in a low phosphorus site, and those plants are displaying some classic signs of phosphorus deficiency. So phosphorus is tricky, not just for organic farmers, because of a whole bunch of reasons that sort of interact with each other. So most soil phosphorus is not in a plant available form. Our soils here on the prairies actually have quite a lot of total phosphorus in them, but most of that is essentially rocks. It's not something that plants can use. So if you look at this diagram of the phosphorus cycle, you'll notice these green ovals that show the different forms of phosphorus in the soil. And there's a lot of detail here that you don't really need to worry about. But the key thing here is that the only little oval that contributes to plant uptake there in the middle is that one in the center called soluble P. And so that's the phosphorus that's actually dissolved in the water, in the soil solution. And that is actually, the size of these ovals is not really representative of the amounts in the soil. That, if they were proportional to their amounts, that would be a very tiny little oval, and the others would be a lot larger. So there's lots of arrows going in and out of that soluble P oval in all kinds of different directions. But what is really interesting is that the arrows going into the soluble P pool, those processes tend to happen fairly slowly. So, you know, once the soluble phosphorus is used up by plants, yes, more does kind of come into that pool slowly from all those other sources, but it tends to be really slow. Whereas the arrows going the opposite direction, going like, for example, over to the right where it says mineral surfaces, clays, etc. You know, so phosphorus can get stuck onto those clays. It can bind with calcium or with iron, and those processes actually happen very quickly and easily. So we have this tendency for phosphorus, when it's added to soil, to get stuck in all those other ovals besides the one in the middle there, the soluble phosphorus. And that happens no matter whether you're adding phosphorus as a mineral fertilizer, as a conventional farmer would, or as manure, compost, other sources. They all follow sort of that same pattern where they can get easily stuck or fixed in the soil in these kind of stable forms that aren't available to plants. The other thing that's really important about phosphorus is the role of soil pH. So this little diagram shows the relationship between soil pH along the bottom and the amount of phosphorus that is, what they call it, phosphorus fixation, or the amount of phosphorus that gets stuck in the soil. And so the dotted lines show the different reasons that phosphorus might get stuck. And you see there's that, what they call valley number 2, just above and a little bit to the left of pH 7, so just under neutral, where phosphorus is more available. That's the highest phosphorus availability range. So if your soils are in that range, kind of, you know, that 6.5 to 7 pH, you're in a real sweet spot when it comes to phosphorus availability. But like many farmers on the prairies, at least here in Manitoba, and I think also in Saskatchewan, a lot of soils are higher pH, 7 up to 8, even there's, you know, up to 8.5 I've seen here in Manitoba. And so those soils, in those situations, there's a struggle with phosphorus getting tied up with calcium in the soil. So knowing your soil pH is really important for managing your phosphorus. Some other things about phosphorus that make it tricky. That soluble phosphorus, so that little tiny bit that is available to plants, it doesn't really move around in the soil very much. It may move only a few millimeters during a whole growing season. So unlike nitrogen, which is moving with water quite easily through the soil, soluble phosphorus doesn't really do that. And so it means that the plants have to go out and get it rather than the phosphorus sort of moving to the plant through the soil. Number 3, phosphorus uptake is really a very energy intensive process for plants. They're taking up phosphorus from the soil at a very low concentration up into a higher concentration environment in their plant, in their tissues. And so they have to actually devote a lot of energy to that. And this means that plants have evolved all kinds of different strategies for getting phosphorus out of the soil. And different plants, different crops use different strategies or combinations of strategies. And so that can make it very difficult to correlate what we might see on a soil test in terms of what a soil test detects in the soil to how a crop actually performs in that soil, because different crops might be accessing that phosphorus in different ways than the soil test is. So I want to talk a bit more about these acquisition strategies. So there's two main approaches that plants use to get that soluble phosphorus. So you'll remember it doesn't move much, and so I said the plants have to go out and get it. So one way they do that is they extend their root growth. They might create thinner roots or more highly branched roots that can get into all the little nooks and crannies in the soil to find more phosphorus. Or they associate with AMF, or arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And then the fungi do that job of exploring the soil, finding, accessing that plant available phosphorus, the soluble phosphorus that's out there, but that is a little further away from the root of the plant. The other approach that plants will use is actually to increase the solubility of the phosphorus that's in the soil. So they will go after all those other ovals that were on the diagram I showed earlier of phosphorus that's not actually available to plants in its current form, and they'll use different strategies or different mechanisms to actually dissolve that phosphorus. So one of those is to acidify its rhizosphere, especially this is important in those high pH soils. So if they can bring the pH down to right around the roots, if they can bring that pH down to that magical like 6.8 or whatever pH level, then the phosphorus will become more available there. And you can see in this image at the bottom, they were able to grow these roots in a substance that was it would change color with the pH. And so you can see the left image is faba bean, the middle one is soybean, and the right one is corn. That the roots were actively changing the pH around in their environment. So faba bean in particular was really acidifying its rhizosphere. The rhizosphere is the soil that's within about 2 millimeters of the root. So that's pretty neat. And plants can sort of do this on purpose, where they can exude these, hydrogen ions to acidify their rhizosphere. They can also produce other compounds that will stick to those other sites in the soil where phosphorus tends to get stuck or fixed. And so then that means that more phosphorus is available to just sort of float around and be soluble. And then plants also produce enzymes that can break down organic phosphorus. So that's phosphorus that is attached to some carbon-based atoms. And so those might be, leftover cell membranes or DNA or something from plants or manure that's decomposing, that kind of thing. So it's pretty interesting how plants will modify their phosphorus acquisition strategies based on, how much phosphorus is actually available in the soil and what form is in the soil. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that, but other than to say that it means that this isn't a straightforward interaction between the crops and the soil. There's a lot going on there. The other thing that makes phosphorus management tricky, and again, this is still for all farmers, not just organic farmers, is that phosphorus is a non-renewable resource, and that small losses of phosphorus from the land or our wastewater systems or anything like that can cause big problems in the environment. So just briefly, this diagram shows us what the phosphorus flows are like in the environment. And you'll notice, we talk about a phosphorus cycle, but that this is not a cycle. It starts with phosphate rock mining, and it doesn't matter if you're using, 1152 phosphate fertilizer or if you're using rock phosphate, it's being mined. It's a non-renewable resource. And then as we follow the red arrows, it gets used in different ways. There's some recycling that can happen over there on the left with the livestock and crop production, and we hope to kind of optimize that as much as we can. But then the arrows end in the waterways and in waste management facilities. A lot of the phosphorus that goes through humans ends up either in the landfill or in our lakes and waters, lakes and rivers. So that is a problem. And so I'll just mention struvite here as an option to kind of help close that cycle a little bit, capture some of the phosphorus from our human consumption and get it back onto agricultural land. The other problem with phosphorus is that what seems like a very small loss from agricultural land can cause a really large problem in our environment. This photo on the left is taken from the experimental lakes area where Fisheries and Oceans, they did this initial work on, what's actually causing these algal blooms in the freshwater systems. And it's so clear to see where there was phosphorus added, that was the real problem. The other nutrients were not so much the issue. And in water systems, the amount of phosphorus that can cause a problem is measured in something like 20 to 50 parts per billion. And in our soil phosphorus, the part that's available to plants or other organisms is measured in parts per million. So when we're losing what seems like just a tiny amount from our fields, it's actually can cause big problems. So moving on now to organic farming. Phosphorus management is especially tricky for organic farmers because of the types of phosphorus inputs that are available. So I'd like to get a little bit of feedback from all of you now who are participating in this webinar. So we're gonna launch a little poll to see what you have actually been using on your farms in terms of phosphorus sources. So there's a little window that has popped up, says which phosphorus sources have you used on your farm in the last 10 years? And you can check off one or more of those options, any of the ones that you have used, or if you haven't used any, then just check off none. And then we'll see kind of what the status is among this group. So there we go, there's some results. Okay, great. So we have half of the group that's used manure or compost, quarter that's used rock phosphate, no one's used a bone meal or other type of product, a quarter have used another type of product, and about a quarter of you have used nothing. And that is really understandable for a bunch of reasons. When we look at these different options for the phosphorus sources, we see that all of them have some issues with them. So I've kind of put together this little, what I call the phosphorus source report card, based not on a lot of in-depth research, I'll say, but that has some basis in my reading and my talking to other people. So compost, so some of the criteria that we need to think about are whether the source is actually bioavailable, as in, is it available for plants to take up? Is it available, as in, can you get it? And how easy is it to actually use? So compost and manure are quite bioavailable, usually. Sometimes the phosphorus concentrations in them can be quite low, in which case the phosphorus kind of gets tied up in the soil, but generally they're good sources of phosphorus. Availability depends where you are. Most of Saskatchewan would score lower on that scale than other parts of the country. There's very little excess manure produced in Saskatchewan. You know, that will depend on your location and your connections with other people. Ease of use depends on your equipment, but you know, it's bulky, it's not necessarily easy to apply evenly, and so it can be a little tricky to use. Rock phosphate, not very bioavailable. Some is better than others, and if you have an acidic soil, then it'll do all right. If you have an alkaline soil or even a neutral soil, most rock phosphate will do basically nothing for you, and as its name applies, it's basically adding more rocks. They may be very, very small rocks, very tiny particles, in which case they will dissolve gradually and become available, but that's a very slow process. Availability, as I understand it, most people can get some rock phosphate if they want to. Ease of use, I haven't really used it, but I've heard from people, especially if you're getting the fine particles. So it's dusty and it's not necessarily that easy to apply. Bone meal products, I don't know much about, but generally they're not that bioavailable. The other thing I'll mention, that struvite, of course, is not available for use in organic yet, or struvite from human sources. Non-human struvite, in this last round of revisions, is being included as a permitted substance, but I have not heard of anywhere where you can actually get it. So currently it gets an F in terms of being actually available, but it does very well in terms of availability to the plants and in terms of the ease of use. So other things to think about are the cost of the product, the environmental footprint. I'm not going to go into those details, but essentially all the phosphorus products or sources that are available to organic farmers have some shortcomings. And so it's important to think about which ones are kind of will make or break a deal for you in terms of you being able to use a phosphorus source on your farm. And we'll talk more about that in a little while. So in terms of phosphorus management for organic farms, I want to talk a little bit about the assessment or diagnosis process in terms of how you decide whether you might actually have a phosphorus deficiency or not. And then also the treatment or management of that deficiency, and what you can do about it. So let's start with assessment or diagnosis. So soil testing is a really important part of a nutrient management plan, no matter what type of farmer you are. And so I want to launch another little poll now. So if we can bring that up, I'm curious to see how often people are soil testing. So the poll has popped up there. How often do you soil test any one particular field? Every year, every few years, or as needed if you suspect that there's a problem there, rarely or never. So if you can check off the one option that best fits your approach to soil testing an individual field, that would be great. And while you're doing that, I'll just say there's a few things beyond nutrients that are really important about soil tests. And the key one in terms of phosphorus is your pH. So knowing your soil pH is really important, and that's not going to change dramatically from year to year. Over time, it can shift a little, but getting to know what your soil pH is on different fields is really, really important. Organic matter levels are also an important consideration for your general soil health and some phosphorus cycling. Okay, so we have our answers. So we have quite a few people who are testing a field every year. More than half doing every few years, and a few as needed if I suspect a problem. That's great. And I had no one answer rarely or never, and that's great. For organic farmers, Generally, I would say it's not necessary to soil test an individual field every year, but every few years is a good idea. And in terms of phosphorus, you want to be aiming for somewhere in that 5 to 15 parts per million of Olsen P. If you get above that, then there's more risk of losses to the environment. And if you're below that, then crops really start to struggle. And we'll talk about that more in just a second. A second key aspect of assessment or diagnosis is just observing plant growth. Because of the things we talked about earlier about how different crops interact with the soil and in how they get their phosphorus, actually just observing how your plants grow can provide you a lot of information about phosphorus availability or other issues as well. And that includes crops and weeds that you can observe. So you'll notice that legumes and brassicas tend to be very sensitive to low phosphorus. Cereals are less sensitive, and flax, for example, is not really sensitive at all. So I'm going to show you a few examples here. So this was organic flax that we grew in 2017. This was part of a struvite experiment. And so we had no effect of phosphorus addition on the flax yield, but you could pick out the control plots just by where there was less wild mustard, the control where no phosphorus was applied. So you can see, you know, these rectangles here at the front there, and then kind of over to the left, and then over in the back, where there's way less wild mustard presence due to associated with the flax crop. So if you were just looking at a flax crop trying to decide whether you had a phosphorus deficiency, you might not see anything. But weeds like wild mustard can be a good indicator. Our legumes are also good indicators in general, especially, so this is hairy vetch planted as a green manure on those very same plots that I showed you in the last picture the following year with nothing else added. And so you can see that same pattern, you know, the middle of the front here where there was no phosphorus, and then over to the left, and then further in the back. So it's pretty dramatic, you know, how poorly that green manure did when there was no phosphorus applied to that system in the year before. And so then what we can see sometimes is if you have a green manure that does very poorly, then you'll have very little nitrogen fixation. And so you might have, say, your following wheat crop look more like the plants on the right of that top picture than the ones on the left, those ones with the nitrogen deficiency. So it's kind of a tricky little thing to think about when you have, for example, a wheat crop that's showing signs of nitrogen deficiency. You might think, well, I don't have a phosphorus problem here, I have a nitrogen problem, which is true. But if you trace that back through the crop rotation and think about how that green manure did the previous year, then perhaps you'll see that maybe there is a phosphorus deficiency at the root of that problem. So it's something to think about. We've done a little bit of work. When I used to work with Martin Entz in the Department of Plant Science, we did some work on this assessment issue, and thinking about how we can bring together soil information and plant information to perhaps diagnose phosphorus deficiencies that are a little more subtle than the ones that I just the one that I just showed you, where the plants just fail to grow. So we're thinking about kind of this interaction between the soil and the plant, where the plant is trying to get phosphorus out of the soil with all those different mechanisms. So the soil test is kind of like asking the soil, well, what do you have on offer for plants, any kind of plants, to take up? Whereas, so that gives a bit of information that's really useful. But due to all those different ways that plants have of getting phosphorus out of the soil, it's also useful to ask the plant, what exactly were you able to get out of the soil? And we can, but beyond just observing the growth, we can do a plant tissue test to see what the crop was able to extract. And some crops are a lot more aggressive at extracting or negotiating, I guess, with the soil in this transaction than others. And so that's a tool that we call the green manure bioassay. I'm going to show you a little bit of data from some on-farm testing that I did with this tool to sort of learn about how it would work and how we could apply it. So I took soil tests and plant tissue tests from a whole bunch of green manure crops across Manitoba and eastern Saskatchewan, and this is the data. So on the bottom, going across the bottom, we've got soil phosphorus, that's the soil test, and going up the side, we have the plant tissue test. Most soil test labs will tell you if your soil test phosphorus is below 10 parts per million in Olsen P, then you've got a problem, and this is too low, that zone on the left of the red line. According to the plant biologists, if a plant has less than about 0.2% phosphorus in its tissues, then the plant is deficient in phosphorus. So that's anything below that blue line. So when we put these two approaches together, we can kind of see some different zones developing, and can think about how we can manage phosphorus based on those zones. So I've kind of divided it up like this. So you can see, this group of dots down in the lower left where the soil test phosphorus is really low, it's below 5, and the plant tissue phosphorus is low. They're all below that 0.2 level. Then we have this group in the yellow box where the soil test is still pretty low, below what a conventional farmer would be looking for, but the tissue test, some of it is quite high and some of it is a little on the low side, but generally not too bad. And then we have this green box over on the side here, the upper right, where there's lots of soil phosphorus, the plant tissue levels are high. So in that green box, there's no issues other than perhaps having excess phosphorus around, but certainly nothing production related. In the red box, we've definitely got a problem. And in that yellow box is where some of those plants are doing really well and some are kind of marginal. And so that's where that tissue bioassay can be really useful, is when your soil test is kind of on the low side, but your crops still seem to be doing okay based on visual observation, but maybe a tissue test can provide you some more information about whether the phosphorus is adequate there or not. The other thing that you can do is a phosphorus budget, kind of like an economic or a financial budget. It's basically quantifying what comes in, what goes out, and looking at the balance. I'm not going to go into any detail here. It's just to say that it can identify your overall trend over time, and it's a good planning tool for planning inputs over the long term. And this is an example of a budget that we did at Glenlee, where we had no manure added versus with manure added. If you are interested in these, in the phosphorus budget and the green manure bioassay, you can take a look at the handouts that are available. There's more information there. A general overview of those tools, as well as this showing the phosphorus concentration of a bunch of different crops, so that you can calculate, so if I had whatever 30 bushels of wheat per acre, how much phosphorus did I actually remove in that crop? So feel free to download those and explore them and get in touch with me if you'd like more information about those. But I want to move on now to treatment and management because my time is slipping away on me. So we want to talk about adding phosphorus, but also about coping with low phosphorus, because there are times when it is really hard to add it. So when adding phosphorus, there's, I think, a few key things to think about. If you only have enough of whatever amendment to add to one field, let's say I would target a green manure or forage crop, a nitrogen fixing crop, a legume. Those are the ones that will benefit the most, and it'll also make it easier to manage certain things like some excess weed growth that you might get from adding that phosphorus. Now, the big question is how much to apply, and that depends on a whole bunch of things. So just your soil test can provide a guideline, and yes, those are geared to conventional farmers, but can give you a guideline on how much might be appropriate to add. But then remember that adding phosphorus can stimulate weed growth. So this is an example of where a green manure the previous year was well below that 0.2%. The soil phosphorus was 4 ppm, so it's in that very low zone. The farmer grew an excellent winter wheat crop on half of that field with nothing added. On the other half, he put on manure and grew spring wheat. Well, tried to grow spring wheat, and it was basically a weedy mess. So just something to keep in mind, that you're going to need a very good weed management plan once you start adding in a lot of nutrients. It's also important to remember that some of that phosphorus that's added, no matter what form it's in, can get stuck or fixed into the soil. And so even though you've added something, you might not see a response right away. So in that case, sometimes it takes some time and a bit of patience to actually see a bit of a phosphorus response, or something to keep in mind. Also, if you've done a phosphorus budget, let's say for your last 20 years of organic farming, and you're like, oh my goodness, I have such a big phosphorus deficiency or a deficit, you don't have to reverse that all at once. You can add small amounts to get the system back on track. Often the most practical and most relevant question is just how much of the phosphorus source can you get or afford? And assuming that there's going to be a bit of a limitation there, you might need to think about how you're going to allocate that maybe a relatively small amount that you can get. And I think I would consider putting on a lower rate of phosphorus on more acres rather than doing a really high rate on a small amount. When you're adding it, it's also really important to get that amendment into the soil and not just surface apply it, if at all possible. So that means banding it in if that's at all possible, or spreading it and incorporating it if you can. Obviously not easy to do on perennial forages, but if you can fit it in the rotation in some way that you can get it actually into the soil, it's great. Something to think about also is what they call starter phosphorus, which is really common in conventional farming, but not really discussed in organic farming. So thinking of a way that we can get phosphorus to crops early in the season to help them get a good start. We also need to think about when you're buying, receiving, whatever, a phosphorus amendment, you need to really be aware of what's actually in there. If you're getting manure or compost, you should get it tested so that you know how much is actually in there. Be aware of contaminants like heavy metals or salts. Salts in manure is a big issue, and then the solubility of that product. So we talked a bit about products before. Rock phosphate, again, there's some red flags there. It's and generally not recommended for our soils here. Manure and compost tend to be the best, but it's important to get an analysis done so you actually know what you're getting. There may be other products out there that are effective. I know of some farmers who have tried a few, but like those, you just be aware of what you're getting. And another approach that I want to just mention is that importing feed or hay, especially if you have conventional cattle and on organic land, to bring in feed for them and then apply their manure to your land can actually be a way to import phosphorus into your farm. The last thing I want to mention about adding phosphorus is I know a lot of these products seem expensive, or it can seem ridiculously expensive to truck manure in from 90 miles away or something like that. But we have to remember that poor yields also have a cost. And just a couple of images and data to support this. So this is an alfalfa grass stand, where on the left you had no phosphorus added, and on the left we have 90 kilograms of phosphorus added 2 years previous to this, and on the right we have no phosphorus added. And so if you are harvesting hay off of the field that's on the right, you're going to need a lot more acres to feed your cattle than if you have the hay crop that's on the left. And the data supported that. This is from the struvite experiment. So in the very first year, we saw that adding phosphorus started to have an effect on the hay yields. And by the third year, in 2019, the hay yield was about 3 times higher, where we added fairly high rates of phosphorus than in the control. And then, of course, remember that that cost of a poor green manure will show up in your other crops as well in your rotation. So knowing that it's not always easy to get phosphorus amendments and get them on, I thought I'd talk a little bit about coping with low phosphorus levels. And so there are some ways that we can optimize the biological nutrient cycling processes and those plant strategies for getting phosphorus out of the soil. And I'll just talk briefly about 3 of them as some options to kind of get you through until some phosphorus can be added. So mycorrhizal fungi are the classic plant soil organism symbiosis. They form these little structures inside the plant cells where they exchange nutrients for energy. So to support mycorrhizal fungi, we want to minimize tillage. It doesn't mean eliminating tillage, but we don't want to have excessive tillage. And we need to make sure we're growing crops that the fungus can associate with, which is most species of crops, except brassicas and buckwheat, a couple others, but those are the big ones. Greater soil organic matter, it helps to support the fungus, and keeping soil phosphorus relatively low will help the fungus kind of thrive a little more. Now, do they actually increase crop yields compared to where there's no fungus? Well, that's hard to test, and it depends on a lot of things, but they really are quite effective at extending the reach of the roots into the soil, but they don't get that other phosphorus that's not soluble. So if there's a kind of sort of a low but not super low amount of phosphorus in the soil, then they can do a good job of kind of fetching it from further away and bringing it to the plant. But they do, okay, I'm going to turn off my webcam. I'm getting a message that my connection is kind of slow. Anyway, to finish up here. So, but the fungus does also demand energy from the crop, and so there's a balance to be found there. But they do probably help crops like flax and corn and potato that really depend a lot on the fungus for their nutrients. Another strategy is cover crops to enhance phosphorus availability, and there's a lot of work that's been done on this, and this is kind of part of what I'm focusing on in my research right now. This is an approach that has received a lot of attention, but there hasn't been a lot of evidence for great results yet. So, and the key thing is that the cover crop biomass needs to have quite a high phosphorus concentration in order for this to work. So you'll remember before, oh, I'm getting weird things popping up here, that we were saying that the critical plant tissue concentration was 0.2%, and below that the plant was deficient. Well, for the cover crop to actually contribute to the next crop's phosphorus availability, that level needs to be above 0.3%. And so you can see in my data from my field trials there was not too many of our green manures that would fit that criteria. And those occurred only where soil phosphorus is pretty high. So yes, cover crops can do that, but you need to, to get that high phosphorus concentration in the cover crop, you maybe need to terminate it kind of early. But at the same time, you still need enough biomass there. So there's a balancing act. You need enough growth, but not mature biomass. So some of the candidate crops that seem to be good at this are buckwheat. Although there's mixed evidence from a bunch of experiments, and faba beans seem to do a reasonably good job, and legumes in general seem to be pretty good. But just a note about buckwheat. So this is from my experiment this year where I've been adding phosphorus as struvite or as 1152 to different cover crops. And on the left, where no phosphorus was added, that buckwheat cover crop is not going to do much for me because its growth was well under half of what it was where some phosphorus was added. So kind of the key thing to remember is that those crops need a little something to work with. The next strategy is to mineralize organic phosphorus, and I'm not going to go into this because it's really poorly understood, but basically suggesting that when the soil tends to have low phosphorus, that the soil microbes that are there will be better at cycling the phosphorus around to the organisms that need it. So if we're thinking about using those strategies, it's really important to remember that these organisms can't make phosphorus out of nothing. They need something to work with if they're going to make phosphorus available for the crops in the rotation. And so if you are coping with low phosphorus, yes, try out some of these strategies, but also please make a plan for phosphorus addition in the future when you can. Okay, so just summing up some of the things we've talked about before we go into questions. I think it's really important to remember that in the long term, phosphorus is often the limiting nutrient in organic farms that don't have a good source of manure. And that it is really complicated, it's tricky. So, we're going to need kind of that mix of testing and observation to actually see whether we've got deficiencies in our crops, in our soils. But then when we get to the addition part, like all of those different phosphorus sources have some shortcomings. And so you need to kind of figure out which ones can work for you. And then once, of course, you've added it to make sure that you've got good crop and weed management practices so that phosphorus is getting to the crop and not causing an excess of weed growth. Super important to remember that extremely low phosphorus in your soil has an economic cost to your farm because of poor growth, but it also has a biological cost. The soil system, including all of the organisms that are in it and the plants, just do not function well and are not healthy when soil phosphorus is so extremely low. And as organic farmers, a healthy soil is a high priority. And so every farmer, organic, conventional, whatever, every farmer needs to have a long-term phosphorus management plan. So thank you very much for the invitation to give this webinar and for your attention today. And I think we have a little bit of time for questions. I went a little later than I was hoping, but we will take a few questions, I think.
Yeah, that's just fine. Thank you so much, Joanne. I do have 4 questions here. So the first one is, crystal green is struvite, correct?
Yes, that is correct. That is the product, the struvite product that is produced by the company Austera. I'll try my camera again. And so far, it's the only one that I know of that's available in Canada. But that is human-sourced struvite. It comes from municipal wastewater.
Okay. Let's see.
So not permitted in organic just yet.
Okay, so not permitted. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so you can't use that just yet. Yeah.
Okay, and the second question is they would like to hear your opinion on guano phosphorus. Oh, have we lost Joanne?
Guano is one of those things
sorry.
that I know actually almost nothing about. Oh, sorry, was there more?
No, that's it. No.
Okay.
There's more questions.
Yeah, I know.
But...
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I know almost nothing about that, other than I know that some tropical islands were basically destroyed in guano collection in the early days of phosphorus transport around the world. Yeah, so I really can't answer too many questions about that. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's fair enough. And the next question is, what are some of the risks or reasons that are in the way of getting human struvite and biosolids registered for uses in organic? Heavy metals, optics, question mark.
Great question. Certainly with the biosolids, there are a lot of issues, and you know, the heavy metals, pharmaceuticals, pathogens, depending on the treatment system, those are all issues. Even just salts and things like that too. In terms of struvite, it's pretty interesting. In Europe, struvite from human sources has been provisionally approved for organic, pending a few hoops to jump through with the general fertilizer regulation for the EU. But the organic community has said as soon as basically as soon as struvite is considered a byproduct and not sewage sludge, then it's green light for using human source struvite in organic. The reason is struvite, when it's formed with a well-designed process, is really very pure. It's a chemical reaction that causes it to form essentially when you have the right amounts of the different nutrients and the right pH. It just naturally precipitates and forms these crystals, and it happens all the time. And this is where it started in wastewater plants. They were having struvite build up in the pipes and block the pipes, and so they're like, well, if we could force it to do that in this stage of the process rather than building up in our pipes, then that would be beneficial. And then the idea was like, oh, well, if we could actually use this as a fertilizer too, then that's a bonus. This reaction means that it's basically only struvite in the struvite. It comes out as a white crystal. There's, depending on the process, there can be trace amounts of different compounds that come with it, but the heavy metals are extremely low, like lower than your typical 1152 fertilizer. There's a small amount of evidence that some antibiotic resistance genes and some pharmaceuticals and that kind of thing can come along with the struvite, but in very low amounts. There is a little bit of concern there that I've heard from one study. There was one study that I've seen that's looked at that. So yeah, so those I think are the barriers. The optics question is a good one, and I think that's one that is going to fade as people realize how effective the process is at extracting this very pure compound from wastewater.
Okay, great, thank you. And the final question, in the green manure bioassay graph, why is there such a difference in plant tissue phosphorus at the lowest levels of soil Olsen P, i.e. in the red box? They seem to
Right.
range between 0.08 and 0.18.
Yeah, that's right. So it's another example, I guess, of the different abilities of different crops to get phosphorus out of the soil, as well as perhaps some different properties of those soils. So perhaps, so all of them were below the 0.2% cutoff, but like you say, some of them were just barely below and some were way below. Perhaps some of the ones that did better, there was maybe more soil organic matter. So then those crops that use the enzymes to get organic phosphorus could get a little more. Perhaps, for whatever reason, the mycorrhizal fungi were doing a little better in the ones that ended up with a higher phosphorus tissue concentration. And that's one of those things that that test, yeah, it can't pick out all of those finer details, but it does show, really does demonstrate the range of crop response on a similar soil test value. So yeah, the soil test value it's important, but it's only one part of the picture, and you do need some of those other observations and perhaps tests to kind of round out the picture.
Okay, well, that was our last question, and I would just like to end the webinar today with a big thank you to Joanne for the work she does and for her presentation today. Thank you for all that have attended the live webinar. And just in about 24 hours from now, you should receive, or you will receive, a recording of the webinar that you can access at any time. And just a reminder that there will be a short survey that will follow the webinar, and we'd be grateful if you would take a few minutes to let us know what you thought of the webinar and to give us some suggestions maybe for future webinars. And again, a big thank you to our sponsors, our gold sponsors, Grain Millers and Alltech, bronze sponsors, Sunrise Foods International, ProCert and BioFert, and then our supporter sponsor, OCIA Canada. And just a plug for past recordings, they are available for sale. So if you didn't register for them at the time and are interested in any of those topics, just shoot us an email at admin@saskaorganic.com. And then our next webinar that we have scheduled at the moment is taking place Wednesday, October 28th, and it's looking at organic grain markets. So we'll be having an organic grain buyers forum, and we're planning the rest of the schedule, so keep an eye out in our digital newsletters and on social media. And that's it for us today. Thank you so much for being here, and have a great rest of your day.